Hi, everybody. So, welcome back. So, this is chapter one, I guess 1.2, picking up where we left off last time. We were talking about, I just left off with ancient Phoenicians and their alphabet, their trading in the Mediterranean, the profound influence that had, carrying goods, ideas, and culture from place to place. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, the impact of the alphabet and how that informs language. So moving on from there, let's get into the history of the ancient Hebrews or Jews. And this lecture is going to be solely on that topic. Now, at first, it might sound kind of odd in a way. We're talking about a religion that today in the world is quite a minority religion. The Hebrew faith, the Jewish faith, is certainly important, but in compared to the other monotheistic religions of today, Christianity, Islam, etc., um, it's a relatively numbers a small religion. But I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on it, and I want to give you guys a little preview why that is, and you can see that on the screen right in front of you. Because in many ways, in this case through Christianity, the ancient Hebrew Jewish faith system became the core source for much of the Western ethical religious concepts. And honestly, you cannot understand Western history, even the United States, our ethical, moral, religious background and views, and of the larger Western world without an idea of where these come from. Although when you get into Greece and Rome, they'll be very impactful in areas of culture, arts, philosophy, military science, um, entertainment, sports, you name it, language, etc. When it comes to our general moral sense in the West, whether the person is a person of faith or not, our historic background in the Western world comes primarily out of the Jewish conception of what is right and wrong, what does morality look like, what does a supreme being or God look like, what's the nature of God, etc. And again, and that comes through Christianity, which we'll get to a little bit later. But right now, let's go back to the origin of this, and let's take a look. All right. So, picking up here, according to the Jewish faith system, they view Abraham as the starter of the faith. Now, they might argue it goes back to Adam, of course, but really, Abraham is the beginning of the Jewish religious, spiritual, cultural identity according to the Jewish belief. It would also be true for Christians and Muslims as well, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. But for now, we'll focus on the perspective as traditionally Jews view him. So, what does Abraham do according to Jewish belief? Well, they believe that he is the beginning of the Jews having a special identity and relationship as God's chosen special people. That is not so unique in a sense. Probably most ancient people have a deity or higher power that they believe is their special local deity. For example, in Athens, it'd be Athena. Some goddess or goddess may be the patron deity of the area. But the Jews are not so much in a location focused in a sense as the sense that they've been chosen and given something special and chosen by God. Now, what specifically makes them a special chosen people? Now, what is it? And for the Jews, and then the important aspect is they believe that unlike every other human being of their era, that the Jews are given direct access to God's will, his vision, morality, all that, and through, in this case, in the written word, which would be the Jewish scriptures. And according to Jewish belief, no other people has God's written will in front of them in black and white like the ancient Jews would have. In this place, they refer to their combined scriptures as the Tanakh, or more commonly known as the Torah. And they consider this, again, what makes them so special and unique, because they feel like essentially this is a love letter, a contract, a description of God's relationship with humanity at large, but specifically the Jews are the ones who receive this, and that gives them a special identity. They feel blessed by God to have this. Basically, they feel like we have this spiritual blueprint of how to function in the world morally and connection to God, and all that implies and means. Now, moving on from that, it comes into maybe an obvious question. So, was Abraham a real person or not? And the term historians use is called historicity, just a fancy word, looks like history course, and that is an origin. Historicity simply means, did this in fact actually take place? Or in the case of Abraham, was he an actual person? Did he actually exist? So there's a lot of scholarship on this. Some scholars believe he's a compilation of various Jewish perceptions, and they coagulated this all into one character that they created. He's really a mythical person, but they created, in this case, they gave him a name Abraham, but he's not really an actual physical real person. And you can see the argument there beneath there. And you don't really know the specifics of it. That's why it's not highlighted for you guys. So you need to sweat the details of it. I just want you guys to know that kind of general outline. On the flip side, other scholars say no. We do believe he was a real person. Now, the difficulty is what evidence would you have one way or another? Now, if you look back on Abraham's traditional lifespan, again, we have a big C here, but circa, we don't know exactly, but Jewish scholars who believe he's a real person, they date his life around that time period, 1813 to 1638 BCE. BCE, by the way, is just another version of BC. BCE just means before Common Era. We can maybe come back to that time measurement a little bit later. But okay, so let's suppose he is a real person. According to the Jewish scriptures, which describe his life, he lived as a nomad part of his life, living in tents. He was not a great king. He was simply a fairly low-level tribal leader of some large family groups. So as a practical matter, what archaeological evidence could you have showing he existed? And you're not going to have some ancient sculpture like you might have from the Egyptian pharaoh or an Assyrian king. You're unlikely to find any possible artifact that would actually say, this is Abraham. Probably the only thing he could have, probably over time, that would survive from almost 4,000 years ago would in theory be maybe perhaps like a signet ring, which he would sign. If he had Abraham's name on that, in theory, if that was buried with him and you found the tomb, perhaps you could say, okay, this is an actual artifact that shows this person. But even that would be highly unlikely. So practically speaking, based on who he was, his status, he's not a king, not a ruler, not a great military chieftain. He's simply a leader of a small family tribal group and never moves beyond that status during his lifetime. It'd be extremely highly unlikely you'd find any artifact from him. So if that's the case, how can you make a decision one way or another? It's basically saying we have an absence of evidence. So maybe he existed, maybe he didn't. Scholars have opinions. Now, one thing scholars can do, and it's interesting, and you can draw your conclusion with this, some scholars say, well, okay, it is true we have no physical artifacts from him. And again, you probably wouldn't have based on who he was. Is there anything else we could do to try perhaps give us a sense of whether he was real or not? And there's one thing you can do, which is does the Jewish scriptures, as described in his life, do they match the contemporary culture of that era? What I mean by that is, let's suppose you believe Abraham is not a real person. He's a mythological invention by later Jewish authors writing perhaps 1,000 years later, much later, who constructed him. In their description of his life, is there likely to be errors they insert there? Language he would have used, clothing style, laws, place names, even the use of language that would be from, say, 1,000 years later, but does not match contemporary records from other sources that do exist for Abraham's supposed lifespan, which again, you can see right there from 1813, again, circa, to 1638. But maybe that, for example, is, you guys know if you watch some old movie from, say, the 40s, they're going to use some lingo, some terms, some clothing, the cars, technology, all that would be vastly different than what we have today. Whereas if you and I, without much research, wrote a novel, because the novel, say, in 1940, and we did not do careful research, you and I might put in verbal expressions, cultural expressions, assumptions that we all have in common today, but frankly, were not used back in the 1940s. Now, if you're doing careful research, hopefully you could fix that. But what I mean by that is, so some scholars looking back at how the Jewish scriptures, the Torah, describes Abraham's life. There's a use of language, cultural interactions, views of the world, place names, all those things. Do they match other contemporary records from that time period that do exist? You see what I'm saying? And the scholars who do believe he's a real person say, yes, they do. So, for example, place names, how they dealt with contracts, the names of various peoples in that time period, that matches his era quite closely. Now, again, that is not ultimate proof, but according to scholars that believe he was a real person say that's strong evidence that the account of his life was written contemporary to his lifespan and it's accurate describing social conditions of that time period. That's a strong piece of evidence. He is, in fact, historicity, a real person. But You can come to your conclusions. All right, so leaving that, let's move on to Moses. Moses is the second person you want to be aware of in the Jewish traditional perspective of who they are as a people. And Moses is going to do something from Abraham and beyond Abraham that makes him really in the pantheon or hierarchy of Jewish belief, one of the most important of all people who have ever lived. And what is it that Moses did? He does two things that makes him so incredibly important in the Jewish conception of who they are as a people and why they're special in the eyes of God. First, he leads the Jews out of captivity in ancient Egypt back to the Holy Land, or today we know Palestine, or contemporary Jewish belief would be Israel. That's huge because they were losing their identity in Egypt. So he leads them from an oppressed situation, as the Jews perceive it historically, in Egypt, where they're enslaved under a lot of pressure and have been there for hundreds of years, about 400 years. And he leads them back to freedom in a place of survival and spiritual vitality back in Palestine, and returns them to the traditional homeland, which Abraham had at one time, in a much earlier time period, lived in. And you can see again the dates. We don't know exactly. Some scholars estimate perhaps 1220 BC that the Jews arrive or Hebrews arrive back in Palestine. Again, that's a matter of scholarly debate, but that's probably not a bad date there. The second thing I want you guys to be aware of, and that's why it's highlighted for you guys, is that according to Jewish belief, Moses receives the law of God directly from God himself, in this case in the form of 10 commandments, and in many of the laws as well. And that Moses is given this by God. Moses writes this down, and this will form the core of the law in Jewish conception all the way down to today. The first 5 books of the Jewish Bible are also believed to have been written by Moses, tradition according to the Jews. That's traditional understanding. There's other arguments on that, but that's traditionally what they believe. And again, so what was brought about Abraham, that specialness, becomes more special because Abraham did not have the written text. He had the identity. But Moses, the one who actually, according to Jewish belief, receives God's law. And it's extremely specific. I mentioned the first 5 books in the Jewish canon, or the Tanakh or Torah. Some of those books are a bit of history. Genesis, the first book, for example. But later books get into a very specific laying out of God's will for his people with very specific laws. 10 Commandments being culturally the most well known. But if you read those early books, it goes into great detail, as the Jews believe, God laying out many aspects of family life, family morality, sexuality, inheritance, warfare, disease, you name it, is covered by, as the Jews would see, God's law for them to function in a blueprint spiritually in the best way possible in connection with God. And that, again, wrap it all up, comes from Moses. I think for time, we're going to fast forward a little bit. Maybe that's good news to you guys. The Jewish temple service is important, but I think maybe we should keep moving. If we had more time, we get into that. But the Jews had a very important center of their belief, like most ancient people, of a temple dedicated to, in this case, Yahweh, or God as they saw it, and that being a very holy divine place. In some ways similar to the Near Eastern peoples around them, but in other ways quite different, which we'll come to a little bit later. Eventually, back in Palestine, the Jews or the Hebrews are going to form a relatively small nation, ruled by various tribes, the various tribes of Israel, which you see there on the map. They divide up Palestine among them. By the way, it's not a very big region, it's fairly small. If you're familiar with Israel, Palestine today, it's not big, but that's the kingdom they carved out in a tribal fashion. The next person you want to be aware of is David. David, in the hierarchy of Jewish belief, is one of the most important leaders. Of course, Abraham is number 1. He's the kind of the father of the faith system, the identity with God. Moses, number 2, and a close number 2, getting the law of God, taking the Jews out of a place of almost annihilation in Egypt and taking them to the promised land as they saw it. They can rebuild their spiritual foundations, worship God freely, function as a nation. And that takes us to David. So what does David do? So David does a couple things, and probably the most important I want you guys to know is he's going to give the Jews, besides just a general region, which is Palestine, it's going to be David who conquers what will be Jerusalem and makes that the capital for the Jews, which in Jewish belief remains a capital spiritually all the way down to 2020 for the majority of Jews. And it's David is the one who seizes that city from the local inhabitants and makes that the capital of the Jewish faith system. Eventually, his son will build the Jewish temple there, and this place has extraordinary meaning for a practicing Jew or the identity. Consider this is the holy city of God in Jerusalem. There's a picture of perhaps, we'll say perhaps, how it would have looked like under David's son, King Solomon. Up here in the northern part, you can see that's a temple complex, and we'll come back to that here in a minute. I wish we had more time. We'd get into some big stories about David, but I think for time, we're going to have to move quickly. There's a picture of Solomon's temple. We don't know exactly what this looked like. It was destroyed by the Babylonians, but the Jewish scriptures is very specific in descriptions of it. And based on descriptions of the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh and Torah, it would look very similar to this artist's conception, or at least fairly close, as it described in the Jewish scriptures. Now, eventually, the Jewish state is divided into two: a southern state around Jerusalem, and a northern state, which is called Samaria. And this takes place for a whole variety of reasons, which we're not going to get into in detail, but apostasy is part of that, and apostasy means falling away from the true faith. Because of that, according to Jewish belief, God allows more powerful predatory nations around them that militarily dominant to begin to chip away and invade into the Jewish space, both in the northern kingdom, which we refer to as Samaria, the southern kingdom, which we refer to as Judea. And over time, both these Jewish kingdoms, the northern one and the southern one, will both of them be eventually conquered by invading people. The Syrians are going to conquer the northern Jewish states, which again we call Samaria, and that would take place in its final form in 722 BC. And the Syrians essentially eliminated the northern tribes from history. I'm not saying DNA, they're totally gone, but they lost all cultural religious identity under Assyrian captivity. And we'll get into why that is a bit later, but Assyrian captivity was forced assimilation. So if you survived the very violent invasion, which is a big maybe, and if you did, you'd likely be enslaved, partitioned without the Assyrian Empire, and forced to assimilate their culture, their religion, their lifestyle. And in the process of that, the northern Jewish religious identity, cultural identity, is completely assimilated and disappears from history. Now, in the south, it'll be a little bit different story, although in the start is going to sound quite similar. So although they survived in southern, southern Palestine, around Jerusalem, they survived the Assyrian invasion, they would not survive the next one, at least in their current form. The Babylonians, the next great Near Eastern empire, will arrive, and after a long, lengthy siege of Jerusalem, will eventually capture Jerusalem, and they will destroy Solomon's temple, which is the centerpiece of the Jewish faith. There's a picture of perhaps how the Chaldean or Neo-Babylonian siege of Jerusalem would have looked. It was well protected by walls. It took the Babylonians a lot of work to get in, but eventually they would. And they are going to destroy Solomon's temple, the Jewish temple, and they're going to kill many Jews in the process. And the remnant, a small remnant, will be left there in Jerusalem and in Palestine, but many others will be taken as captives into the Babylonian Empire for their uses. This was a terrible event for the Jews, of course. Not only are the northern tribes no longer intact anymore, they're entirely dissipated and really disappeared page of history, but now even the only remaining two southern tribes around Jerusalem, both of them, many of them are dead, and many have gone into captivity in the Babylonian Empire. Some are left, some of the poor are left there around Jerusalem. You can see some artwork depicting that. On the left, you see a depiction of Babylonian forces, or at least people working for them, demolishing parts of the Jewish temple. And on the right, you can see people being driven into exile. So what this means is Judaism becomes a stateless religion. So they no longer have a nation. They're driven into exile. And they'll be in the exiled state for quite a bit of time, which we'll come back to in a little bit. But fortunately for them, and we'll come into more details of this a little bit later, but they would, under the Persians, and when we get to the Persian, we'll talk about this in more detail, but under the Persians, the Jews who survived and were able to maintain their religious cultural identity in exile in the Babylonian Empire were allowed by the succeeding empire, the Persians, to actually return to the area of Jerusalem, and along with local surviving Jews who still are there, able to reconstitute, greatly weakened and humbled, but a Jewish a religious awakening there in Palestine. And for a brief period of time, although they're still under Persian control, but they're allowed to reconstitute the religious faith system and even begin to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. So for a time, it looked like, even though they're under part of the Persian Empire is fairly tolerant of them, and they're able to rebuild and reconstitute themselves there around Jerusalem. But the page of history turned, and Alexander the Great arrives there, destroys the Persian Empire, and although he didn't tamper with them, but his successors, the Greek successor who ruled this part of the former Alexander Great's empire, decided the Jews were strange and weird, did not understand the Jewish religion at all, nothing like the Greek religion, and that the Jews need to rapidly assimilate Greek culture whether they like it or not. It wasn't really an invitation. It was a command which says all Jewish religious practice must stop, and you must convert to the only reasonable, sensible religion, which is the Greek world system and the Greek thought system. Now, some Jews under pressure of both death and economically would assimilate and become Greek in all but name and heritage. But there were other Jews who we cannot do that. We cannot abandon who we are. It's a complete denial of who we are, our faith. We cannot do that. And they decided to revolt. They would do that, and that's what you guys know. Next thing in your notes is called the Revolt of the Maccabees. And this took place, you can see the dates there a little bit. Around 160 or so, the Jews are going to revolt against their Greek overlords. Fortunately for them, the Greek overlords were distracted through warfare in other areas and through a remarkable guerrilla warfare campaign. And despite the terrible odds against them, the Jews are able to kick out the Greek forces that were their colonial overlords. You can see there in the artwork in the middle of the page there, you can see an example of that. You can see the heavily armored Greek knights fighting against schoolyard level armed Jews revolting against them, who are using slingshots or whatever else they can get their hands on, but they do not have the high level military weapons that the Greeks had. But despite that, the Jews are able to win their independence. And this is critical, and you see that in the notes there. This is a revival of the Jewish nation being able to practice their faith as they see it, and they're briefly independent and autonomous. So Jews all the way down to 2020, we're talking right now, look back at this seemingly miraculous victory by the ultimate underdog, which is the Jews, poorly armed, small forces able to defeat the powerful Greek successor state. And really their only explanation was, besides we fought hard, but they feel that obviously it's God's direct blessing that made this possible. Without God's intervention, not possible. And they feel that this event allowed them to preserve the identity, like their very identity as a people. So don't even know all the details of that. I just want you guys to have a general view of the Maccabees. In our popular culture, you guys might recognize the holiday of Hanukkah. You guys probably all, at least generally, feel that's one of the most important Jewish holidays of the year. I guess in our Western perception, it's equivalent of Christmas, but that's not really correct at all. But maybe in importance, perhaps for the Christians, and in this case for the Jews, Hanukkah may be perhaps similar. You heard the expression, the Festival of Lights. What that comes from is, according to Jewish belief, when they finally kicked the Greeks out of Jerusalem, they returned the temple. The temple had been desecrated by the Greeks. And specifically, one aspects of temple worship, which had gone back all the way to the Jewish fleeing and escape and exodus from Egypt, and the earliest Jewish temple complex, in this case, movable tent. Part of that was an implement called the menorah. I mean, you guys, again, probably recognize that term. There's a menorah there on the right. You can see one on the left, too, being written by a Jewish rabbi. The menorah symbolizes God's presence with his people. So according to Jewish belief, there was a large menorah inside the temple. It was fed continuously with olive oil and burned 24/7. Significance of that was olive oil represents basically the Holy Spirit or God's presence for the Jews. So to have that lit 24/7 in the temple means God's presence is with us. So backing up a little bit. So when the Jews are able to kick the Greeks out of the temple complex and reclaim Jerusalem, as they rush in the temple to go in, the temple is in bad shape, desecrated. They find a menorah, and again, in celebration, they hope to relight this, showing their again continued devotion and relationship with God and his presence with them. Because of all the warfare, all the devastation, though, it turns out they realized they only had enough olive oil to light it briefly. But that within a day or so, because of lack of olive oil, again, due to the fighting, all the chaos taking place. They'd run out of oil and the menorah would go out. Now, again, in our current perspective, like, okay, well, a week or so, get some new olive oil, do what you got to do, and rely on everything's fine. But for the Jews, that was a crushing disappointment to have it go out because in the Jewish temple service, it never went out. It burned 24/7 for hundreds of years as they self-perceive this. Again, that's God's communion presence, that he never leaves us. For us to allow the menorah ever to go out is a sacrilege. It's a disaster. So they're stuck, which is, again, celebrating the free Jerusalem, to clean the temple, they have menorah there, and they're going to light it. But tragically, they know within a day or so it's going to go out. And yes, they can get some olive oil later on, but just psychologically, after all the trauma they've gone through, it just seems like one more additional blow. But they decide, well, what can we do? And they light it. Again, expecting after maybe a day or two, it'll naturally go out, and then it might take, who knows, a week, 10 days, whatever, for us to be able to get a new shipment of olive oil to make it run again after all this devastation. And perhaps you guys know the rest of the story. According to Jewish belief, even though the olive oil, in theory, absolutely would have run out, the supply was very limited. It did not run out for all those days, for 8 straight days, although scientifically not possible, but the menorah does not go out. After 8 days, they do get a fresh supply of olive oil is brought in, maybe DHL or Amazon delivered it, and it gets delivered, and they can now naturally put oil in there to keep it burning. The only explanation in the Jewish belief was obviously it's a divine miracle from God or Yahweh to give his seal of approval and reconnection with the Jewish people. And that is the origin of the Festival of Life, or Hanukkah, as you and I in our culture are aware of it, one of the most important of all the Jewish holidays. And again, the point of that is it's survival of itself of the Jewish people from almost non-existence and almost coming back from the brink of absolute annihilation and feeling, despite the incredibly long odds and all the twists and turns and the trauma and loss and violence and death, that they are able to survive and build something anew. All right, so let me move on to our new section notes. Let me pick this up. All right, so continue on. This, what you're looking at in front of you, is a depiction of how the Jewish temple perhaps would look like in about 1 AD or so, or maybe in the time of Christ, if you're familiar. Now, by the way, Jews are not like that reference, so but let's say during the Roman period, before the destruction of the Jewish temple, this is likely how the Jewish temple would have looked. This would be the third incarnation of the Jewish temple, the first destroyed by the Babylonians, the second one built, and this is the third one. It's referred to as Herod's temple. It would have dominated Jerusalem, as you guys will see here in this larger map. It was a massive temple complex. It is one of the highest, it was by far the highest building in all Jerusalem. If you were a Jewish pilgrim walking toward Jerusalem for one of the religious holidays, the first thing you'd see in Jerusalem would be the temple towering above the city. It's one of the great wonders of the world, architecturally, of that time period. You could not miss it. You'd never have to ask, like, where's the Jewish temple? I'd like to, I need to get it with GPS, give me the coordinates. You would see it instantly because it dominated the city, which gives you a sense and the Jewish idea of how critical this temple service is to them, and a feeling of God's presence with them in the city. Now, history's going to take another turn here, as you guys probably aware. The Jews are briefly independent, but then the Romans arrive. And the Romans, as they're wont to do, conquer nearly all of the Western world. That would include Palestine. And the Jews now come under Roman occupation. The Romans, frankly, don't understand the Jews at all. Their religion and culture are so different, just as the Greeks were. I would say the Romans, to some extent, are religiously tolerant. When I say tolerant, though, I want to define that a little more. The Romans are religiously tolerant if they feel that your religious culture in no way poses a threat culturally or spiritually in any function to the Roman state control or imperial control. So if the Romans feel that you worship your local gods, but that local gods in no way interfere with Roman control, in no way it can cause dissent or cultural disruption, the Romans don't care. That's fine. If the Romans believe that any way that your religion in any way poses a cultural or ruling threat, they'll crush it mercilessly, especially if they don't understand religion at all. And frankly, the Romans had no interest and did not understand the Jewish faith at all. The Roman faith system is very different. They could not understand the Jews. Jews seemed, for lack of a better term, weird to them. Their faith system, the Jews are monotheistic, they believe in only one God. Romans have a whole pantheon of gods. The Jews have very strict moral behavior, at least in theory. People are people that the Romans just cannot relate to. The Jews have dietary requirements. They don't eat pork. The whole series of things that the Jews don't do that the Romans think just makes no sense. Bacon's delicious. Why would you make a rule like that? We just don't understand your God at all. This is going to lead to trouble. The Romans don't respect the Jewish faith system. The Jews are deeply fearful of the intrusion of Roman culture, not to mention Roman taxes, Roman overlordship, Roman behavior toward the Jews, condescending, that's what I'm looking for, condescending behavior toward the Jews, and I'd even say to a certain degree cultural intolerance of the Jews. Now, some Roman governors could be quite talented and successful and I'd say relatively tolerant of conquered territories. But the next Roman governor may not be, and he could be rapacious, which means greedy, high taxes, disrespect local culture, exploitation of local culture, and frankly, a brutal treatment of the local inhabitants if he so chose. And that's what's going to happen for the Jews. It gets so bad for them that eventually they figure we can't take it anymore, that there's a cultural, spiritual erosion that the Romans are doing to us. They don't respect us. At times, they kill the Jewish leadership. They mock the Roman religion, insult the temple, and eventually Jews feel we can no longer take this as sacrilege to God, to our faith system. We Roman taxes to them. They treat us as not even third-class citizens in our own, what we believe should be our nation. They deeply, deeply resent it. And one Roman governor in particular was exceptionally brutal. And this leads to the first great Jewish revolt, which is one I want you guys to know. Now, the good news for you guys is you don't really know the details here, but you can see the dates there, 66 to 73 CE, or Common Era, or you can say AD. And the Jews initially, for a brief period of time, are quite successful in their revolt. Artwork you guys see there shows the Jews regaining control of Jerusalem by killing any Roman soldier or Roman citizen they get their hands on. They completely eliminated the Romans from Jerusalem and the surrounding communities and cities. But Rome was not an empire to take that line down. So despite the fact that early Jewish victories and the Jews briefly able to carve out an independent political institution, but the Romans are not going to take this revolt lightly. They have an empire to maintain, as you guys all know, and they're not going to allow the Jews to break off and do this. So the Romans return with a vengeance. And after a very long, hard-fought campaign, the Romans, who have an outstanding military, as you guys are probably aware, are able to slowly reduce the Jewish strongholds and capture them, and one by one, eventually besiege Jerusalem itself. It's a very hard-fought campaign. Jerusalem is a very big city in the ancient world. Very good walls. The population is incredibly motivated to resist. It's a brutal, hard-fought siege on both sides. But the time is not with the Jews. Eventually, the Roman soldiers are able to break into Jerusalem. When they get in, they're mad, they're angry, they're enraged. All the bloody fighting taking place, brutality, when the Romans finally get in, the army goes berserk and kills most of the inhabitants of the city, at least many of them. They get them up at the Jewish temple. They had orders from their commander, I think it was Titus, not to destroy the Jewish temple. It's one of the wonders of the world that time period. The soldiers were so angry and so mad when they got the temple that they decided to burn it, despite the orders of their commander, and that temple would be burned. Not just burned. When finally the smoke settled, in order to teach the Jews the ultimate lesson, the Romans decided not only we're going to burn your building, we're going to completely and entirely demolish the Jewish temple. And I say completely, I mean completely. You go to Jerusalem today, you'll see that great platform where the temple used to be, but today it's wiped clean where the temple was. Don't hold your breath, find any pieces from it. Again, the great platform is there. And let me show that to you. There it is. The great platform is still there. I see that in front of you. Now today you have some structures there. This is the Islamic mosque called the Dome of the Rock. But the Jewish temple, which would have occupied this big platform right here, is entirely wiped clean. This is deep level psychological warfare from the Romans. Because in the ancient world, your God protects your city. He or she is your protector deity. So when the Romans destroy the temple, it's not just to teach the Jews a lesson. It's further than that. They say, your God does not exist. And if he does exist, he cares nothing about you. This is critical for you guys to know. You'll definitely see this on the exam. This is a cataclysmic religious culture emotional blow to the Jewish faith. That temple, which they had worked so hard to eventually rebuild, the center of their faith, their religious life, has now been entirely destroyed by the Romans. To this day, there's nothing left, as I mentioned. There'll be other revolts, but that's the one I want you guys to know by the Jews. There's some depictions of the fighting there in Jerusalem. That artifact you guys see on the left of your screen is one of the very few artifacts that remains from this time period. I mentioned the Romans did an extremely thorough job destroying the temple. So Jews couldn't even put a giant jigsaw puzzle piece together again, try to rebuild it. It was like, no, not let you do that. One of the very few pieces I found is that you see that small fragment of stone there, and that actually was not from the actual temple structure itself. It was from an outlying structure announcing this is where you blow the trumpet. That's one of the only artifacts I found from the larger temple structure, and that's a fairly small one. You see a depiction of Roman soldiers carrying the candelabra or menorah from the temple. That's a Roman coin from the time period. This is a coin showing the Roman emperor in that time period and his capture of Jerusalem. On the right there, you can see the Latin. You see it says IVDA. It means Judea. And they have been captured by the Romans. If you look carefully, you see a palm tree right in the middle. You see a woman on the right side. She has her one hand on her chin. She's in grief. The Roman soldiers standing behind her as the Romans are claiming victory over the Jews in Jerusalem as we capture the Jewish territory. If you have a chance to visit Rome, of the many amazing things you guys can see there, I recommend going to the Arch of Titus. Titus was a Roman general who was in charge of the Jewish campaign and then ultimately the capture of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple. So when he eventually arrived back in Rome, he eventually became emperor. And in order to commemorate his great military achievement, which Romans like to do, he had this arch constructed there. Arch has been damaged fairly heavily, but the arch is still there today. If you walk through the arch, you look on the side, you'll see a depiction of the great triumph or victory parade of Roman soldiers parading through Rome carrying artifacts from the Jewish temple. In this case, you can see Roman soldiers there carrying the menorah or candelabra there through the streets of Rome, showing that their destruction of the Jews and their victory over them. This next section is not highlighted for you guys, but I mentioned how the Romans want to teach the Jews a lesson, which is you do not revolt against Roman control. For example, they made the Jews pay a special tax to support Roman temples, which not only do you no longer have your temple, you now have to pay a tax for Roman temples. That's again, this is the ultimate psychological torture for the Jewish faith. And the Romans trying to say your God either does not exist or he doesn't care about you. In fact, you're going to support our gods. You don't have to, it doesn't matter what you believe in them, you're required to pay this tax. There's Jerusalem today. That huge platform the Jewish temple used to be. Again, that platform is still there. So you can see like a shadow of what used to be there, that massive platform being there. Now, for Jews today, since the temple structure is entirely gone, all they have left is, again, that massive platform. That platform does date from that time period. It's called the Wailing Wall, place of grief for Jews. Oftentimes, it's one of in the Jewish belief, it's the holiest site in Jerusalem that still is intact and exists. And you'll see some Jewish men there going there to pray. If you go there today too, you can visit it. It's a place of respect, obviously, to Jews. There's a women's section, a men's section. This is the men's section. They're going there to pray because those stones do date from that time period of the last of the Jewish temples, in this case, Herod's temple. There's a bar mitzvah there taking place at the Wailing Wall. And I think we're going to stop right there. In our next lecture, we'll get to Jewish religion theology. So I think that's enough for now. So we'll see you for the next lecture.